The year was 1881. Acting U.S. Signal Corps Lieutenant Adolphus Greely from Massachusetts was determined to discover the polar Arctic and set new exploration records for the U.S.
He enlisted in the Army very early, and actually he was 17, so he was a lifetime career Army man. He had fought in the Civil War and was wounded in the Civil War and was a decorated soldier.
That's Buddy Levy, the author of the new book Labyrinth of Ice, The Triumphant and Tragic Greely Polar Expedition. Levy says that Greely was an outdoorsman who was well accustomed to harsh terrain and shifting climates. Determined to reach the farthest northern points of the world, Greely assembled a group of 24 men to join the quest that was first named the Lady Franklin Bay Expedition, but is now better known as the Greely Expedition. Levy says that many of these men came largely from the U.S. Signal Corps and cavalry and knew little of what was to come.
They weren't trained scientists. They were essentially learning on the job. Greely did bring along a college-educated meteorologist named Edward Israel, who was instrumental in taking a lot of the weather readings. There was also a man named Octave Pavey, who Greely picked up in Greenland on the way, who had already been stationed on another expedition, but that thing fell through. So this man was a naturalist and a doctor. And then Greely relied on some of his more dependable officers to help train some of the other men. And it was a lot about delegation and learning on the fly.
So, what did Greely hope to achieve through the Arctic venture? Levy says the goal was to mainly collect new scientific data about the largely undiscovered region. The other was to become the first expedition to reach the North Pole. Little was known about the hazardous, icy landscape, and the crew casualty rate for these expeditions hovered at around 50%. A previous Arctic expedition in 1845, led by British explorer Sir John Franklin, was deemed a failure, with 129 crew members and Franklin never seen again and presumed to be dead. In the 19th century, Levy says traveling to the northern Arctic was as momentous as becoming the first to climb Mount Everest or travel to the moon.
I think it was like going into space because the polar regions were uncharted on global maps at the time. So we've got this group of 25, mostly Americans, heading to a place that has never been stepped foot on before. And, so it's a lot like space exploration, where we don't really know exactly what we're going to find there. We don't really know what the conditions are like there. And there had been a lot of speculation about this, what was called at the time the open polar sea. And there was a theory that had been batting around that once you broke through this thick layer of ice up near the North Pole, that the sea opened up into this sort of tropical paradise.
While that would have been nice, Greely never believed these dramatic theories about the uncharted expanse. He knew the biggest feat in itself would be overcoming the frozen terrain and staying alive in temperatures that could get as low as minus 100 degrees Fahrenheit. With this in mind, the voyage began in August of 1881 when Greely and his 24 men arrived by ship at the far northeastern edge of what is now today Canada.
They were brought in a very sturdy steamship called the Proteus, which was able to bring along, thousands and thousands of pounds of food, canned goods, frozen and dried and preserved meats, and really elaborate food products for a couple of years, 3-year stay. And significantly, they also had tons and tons of lumber, pre-cut timber that was used to build a 65-foot by 20-some foot longhouse, which had bunks and quarters for the men, and also numerous outbuildings for their scientific study and for storage. So they were dropped there, and then that boat, that ship, the Proteus, left when the ice conditions allowed it to. This was August of 1881. And so they were being left quite literally at the far end of the Earth.
Levy says the plan for the expedition was that the ship would come back the next year or the following to resupply the men. But for now, they were stocked to the brim with food and supplies and needed to set up camp. They named the lodge Fort Conger, and it was located 1,000 miles north of the Arctic Circle. The first Christmas at the camp was a joyous one, marked by a big feast.
They had incredibly opulent and elaborate provisions, including things like smoked salmon and lobster and all sorts of fricassees of beef and beef Wellington. They even had confections from like really fine New York candy stores. Greely wanted to make sure that the morale was great. So at the beginning, the first season that they're there, what's important to remember is that the sun, there's this thing called the long night or polar winter, and the sun goes down at that latitude at about mid-October, and then it doesn't rise again until mid-February. So it's dark for nearly 4 months, or almost dark, sort of a perpetual twilight. And Greely understood that that would work on their minds. And so he made a big deal about Thanksgiving and Christmas. And that first Christmas, they have this incredible 7-course meal.
Stocked with provisions and shelter, the men survived the long winter and awaited the next shipment of supplies come summertime. In May of 1882, Levy says the explorers broke the 300-year-old record by trekking to the farthest north point ever recorded and then returning back to camp. By August, however, no shipment arrived as the huge swaths of ice and massive icebergs still remained, making the area impassable by ship. The men survived another harsh winter, but again, no restock came the following summer of 1883, creating a dire situation. With no help in sight, Greely and his men decided to pack up the camp and venture south on small rafts in hopes of finding supplies and rescue.
If you drop a mitten and lose your mitten for 5 minutes, you're likely going to lose your hand. So it's just everything is heightened. So they pack up all of their gear and scientific equipment and all of their records, and they board Fort Conger shut and leave the dogs that have been helping them make all of these expeditions and forays. And they take this steamship, Lady Greely, it's 28-foot-long steamship. It's more of a steam launch, and a number of whale boats, oar boats, and they tether those behind this steamboat, and they strike south into the water. And it's really dramatic because ships 200 feet long get crushed in the ice like kindling, and here you've got this small flotilla of not very experienced nautical men and boats heading into these unknown waters.
The men had little food and supplies left and were surrounded by a literal labyrinth of ice that stretched as far as the eye could see. The arduous journey and average temperature of minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit quickly took its toll.
Malnutrition and starvation and some scurvy began to set in, and at this point, they don't have enough food to have the kind of nutrients and nutrition and vitamins that they need. So even then, they last something like 8 months before the first casualty occurs.
As the men became desperate, they started to live off the land, hunting seals, birds, and anything that would provide some kind of sustenance. During this time, Greely's wife never gave up hope and rallied public support in the U.S. for the government to pull together a joint rescue effort. Finally, in 1884, the Navy was brought on board and deployed rescue ships to find the lost men.
This rescue mission with 3 ships, and there's sort of a race with these Arctic whalers from Newfoundland. They're like mercenaries who are going to try to help. And so they're all moving their way up through these serpentine leads of ice, which are closing fast. And it's really quite dramatic because if they can't get through this ice into some open water, then you know that Greely and all his men are going to perish.
During the winter of 1884, many of the men perished from hypothermia and starvation, and the remaining were on the brink of death, scribbling their last wills and testaments, hoping that one day the notes would reach their families. As months passed and the ice thawed, the summer of 1884 brought rescue, but by then, few remained.
Finally, out of the gloam, Greely thinks he hears this sound of a ship's whistle. And it turns out that they're found remarkably, in part because they've kept one of their instruments, this pendulum. They've put it up on this promontory, and the rescuers see it.
In the end, only Greely and 6 others survived the polar expedition and returned back to the States. Levy says that despite the losses, the heroism and perseverance to survive exhibited by the crew and their commander is what's remembered throughout history and sets this Arctic voyage apart from the others.
There are men who will risk their own lives for the good of the rest and who agree to go out on these forays to try to find these caches of food that have been presumably left that they know of from previous expeditions to the area. And so there's hundreds and hundreds of pounds of canned and tinned meats that some of the men are willing to risk their lives to go get. And so you have these men who step out of the tent and then leave for 5 days to a week and come home frostbitten and just bedraggled. And at the same time, you've got Greely, who is holding in his arms some of these men at their last breaths as they're saying goodbye.
You can find out more about the Greely expedition and our guest Buddy Levy, as well as his new book, Labyrinth of Ice, The Triumphant and Tragic Greely Polar Expedition, at his website, buddylevy.com, or at viewpointsradio.org. Also follow Viewpoints Radio on Twitter and Instagram for more behind the scenes. This segment is written and produced by Amira Zaveri. I'm Gary Price.
"2019 was a year of important discoveries about Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. Making news this year, researchers learned that Alzheimer's risk genes are different in men and women. This could help explain why 2/3 of people living with Alzheimer's are women. Other studies in 2019 found that vision and hearing loss may increase dementia risk, especially when both sensory impairments are present. There are also new discoveries about lifestyle, according to Dr. Keith Fargo, Director of Scientific Programs and Outreach at the Alzheimer's Association.
A healthy diet and regular exercise are good for your overall physical health, but researchers have also found that they can reduce your risk for cognitive decline and dementia. These healthy habits, along with things like cognitive stimulation, may even help people who are at high risk due to their genes.
Researchers say a simple blood test to detect Alzheimer's earlier is on the horizon, and 2 recent announcements have increased hope for new Alzheimer's drug treatments. To learn more about Alzheimer's research and how you can participate, visit alz.org.
Our schedules are incredibly hectic, and with all the things we have to do, there's not enough time for the things we actually want to do. That's why it's more important than ever to find smart ways to save time without sacrificing quality. How can Idahoan mashed potatoes give you more time to spend doing the things you love? By helping you put delicious real mashed potatoes on the table in just 5 minutes. We start with 100% real Idaho potatoes from local growers, and then we wash, peel, boil, and mash them just like you would at home. After cooking each batch, we simply fresh dry the mashed potatoes so they're ready for you to prepare at home. Idahoan takes the time to create great tasting mashed potatoes from scratch, so you don't have to. Find out more at idahoan.com. That's idahoan.com.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Viewpoints is a production of MediaTrax Communications. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows. And find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints.
Coming up on Viewpoints.
This feeling of I don't have enough time for anything is, I think, everyone is feeling it. Just it's kind of coming from different places a little bit.
What's stressing you out? Finding time to decompress in a 24/7 world. Then,
when people exercise, often they can start off feeling kind of cranky or not wanting to deal with life and other people. And afterwards, they're like, oh, I love people. I'm ready to engage with life.
How minutes of movement can change your mood in an instant. I'm Marty Peterson.
and I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.